welcome to Tiny Teacup Reads. Thank you for being here. It is June, which means it is time for another monthly reading wrap-up and for me to tell you everything that I read in the month of May. I read 12 books in the month of May, which I'm really happy with, especially since it was a really stressful month at work. My hours have gone up and I've had to do a lot of overtime. So the fact that I got any reading done at all is pretty impressive. So let's just get into it. The first book that I read in the month of May is one that has been on my Goodreads want to read list for at least a decade, and that is Ask the Passengers by A.S. King. This is a YA coming-of-age book about Astrid, who is in high school and is struggling with the fact that she has a secret girlfriend. I remember this book was pretty hyped up when it came out in 2012, but to be honest, I found it a little bit lackluster. It was an enjoyable read, but I just never found myself connecting to any of the characters. Also, I really didn't like the romance between the main character and her girlfriend. They kind of seemed terrible for each other and there wasn't really any chemistry there. So I give it a 3.5 stars. It wasn't terribly written or anything. It just wasn't as great as I'd hoped. Then I read Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This came out in the late 70s, so it's one of those books that I always just kind of knew existed but never got around to reading until now, and it was a surprise 5 stars for me. I thought the plot sounded really intriguing, but I did not expect to end up loving it as much as I did. I do need to do a full review of this because the plot is a little bit complicated and there is so much that I want to say about it that doesn't have space here. But the basic plot is that Dana, who is a modern black woman in her 20s, time travels unexpectedly back into the antebellum South. She seems to be kind of linked and pulled back to that time by the son of a plantation owner who then grows up to inherit the plantation himself. So it explores the very difficult reality of what life was like, not just for black people at the time, but especially for black women, and focuses on how Dana tries to keep herself alive while also trying to make a positive difference in the time that she has suddenly found herself in. The plot is a little bit outlandish at first, but once I got over the whole unintentional time travel thing, I got so invested in both the plot and the characters, and I was on the edge of my seat for the entirety of the second half. Also, the complicated relationship between Dana and Rufus, the plantation owner that she is linked to, is something that is so interesting and I could just go on and on about because I found it so well written. It's not an easy read because of the subject matter. There are some terrible things that happen to characters and it gets a little bit graphic, but if you can stomach it, I think it is a really good read. Then, of course, it's not a reading month unless I read an Agatha Christie book, and this time I read They Do It With Mirrors. This is a reread for me and part of the Miss Marple series, which I really love. This is set in a juvenile reform home where somebody gets unexpectedly murdered and Miss Marple has to figure out who did it. It's not one of Agatha Christie's best, but it was still enjoyable. A 3-star read. I'm still making my way through the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series by Rick Riordan, and in May I read The Battle of the Labyrinth. That's when Percy and his friends have to make their way through the mythical labyrinth of Daedalus. It was a very fast-paced adventure, a 4 out of 5 stars. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty is a non-fiction memoir that I have a full review of on my channel. In this, the author recounts her own experiences while she was working at a crematory, as well as exploring the topic of death in general and how it fits in with our society as well as past societies, and it was a very fascinating read and I gave it a 5 stars. The Miseducation of Cameron Post by Emily M. Danforth is another one that has been on my list of to read books for at least a decade. This is another YA coming-of-age story about a queer teenage girl. Cameron's parents die right at the beginning of this book in a car crash on the same day that she kisses another girl for the first time when she is 11, which sets up the very complicated feelings that she has about her sexuality that is explored over the next few years. She gets taken in by her very religious aunt, who ultimately ends up sending her to a conversion camp. So it is a very heartbreaking and often difficult read, especially since it is so rooted in reality, but it was really good. It was well written and explored some really interesting topics, and I gave it a 4 stars. So after that, I really needed something more lighthearted, and I went with Austenland by Shannon Hale. I really liked this movie, so when I heard that there was a book, I knew that I had to give it a try. This had the most fun premise. It is about Jane, who is a massive fan of the Jane Austen books, and when she gets the opportunity to travel to England to this resort that basically allows you to role play being in a Jane Austen novel, she goes and does it. They dress up in these Regency outfits, and there's actors who pretend to be your love interest, and maybe the lines get blurred with that. This book is not going to have you thinking seriously about the dynamics of class and gender of the time, and about how Mr. Darcy was only able to be that rich because he was exploiting the labor of the working class, but you kind of want to just shut off your brain and have a good time. This is the perfect read. It was a 4-star. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne is an adventure story about a man who makes a bet that he will, as the title suggests, travel around the world in 80 days. He is aided and sometimes hindered by his servant as they make their way around the world by ship, train, and even elephant. This was a really fun read. It was published in the later 1800s, which is when I find that novels become closer to what they are today. So from a modern perspective, this was really easy to read and very fast-paced. It is very much from its time though, so there are some less than complimentary passages about the exotic locations that the main characters visit and what they think about the locals there. But I was not expecting to enjoy this one as much as I did, and I ended up getting really invested to see whether or not they would manage to win the bet. So another 4-star read. A book that has been recommended a lot as sort of a quick and cozy read is Days at the Murasaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagasawa. The main character of this book is a young woman in her 20s living in Tokyo whose boyfriend casually tells her one day that he is marrying another woman. Heartbroken, she moves into the bookshop that her uncle owns. It does touch on the idea of finding beauty in the mundane things in life and the importance of family and friendships and community, but I was expecting a little bit more. I do have to say it was really interesting for me to read a book that was set in Japan, which is a culture that I'm not that familiar with, and to explore that via a book, and it was a quick read, so I gave it 3 stars. Next up, we come to both my favorite and most surprising book of the month, which is The Lost Story by Meg Shaffer. I'd never heard of this book before. I just stumbled across it on my Kindle and got it because the plot sounded really interesting and it was pretty cheap. I need to do a full review of this one too because I have so many things to say. But to sum up the plot really quickly, it is about 2 teenage boys who disappear into the woods where they enter a magic kingdom and then return 6 months later. The book picks up again 15 years after that, so when the boys are adults and about the time that they go back to that magical land. It had a very solid plot, but my absolute favorite part of this was the 3 main characters and the amazing relationships that they have with each other. It was a 5-star read. I had such a good time, and I really need more people to read this. All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Marie Remarque is another book that has been on my radar for years before I finally got to it in May. It is about a group of German soldiers in World War I. As a fan of historical fiction, I've read a lot of books that are set during wars, but usually from the perspective of someone on the home front. And this book is inspired so much by the author's own experience of being a soldier on the front lines, and I think it really shows in this book. It feels almost autobiographical, which makes it even more heartbreaking when the narrator laments about how he and his fellow soldiers are sacrificing at best their youth and their future for this war, and at worst their lives. This book is very critical of war and this idea that a few people in power have the ability to make choices that, kill and injure and starve and traumatize a whole population. So much so that it was actually banned by the Nazis, which is very understandable, because if you're trying to start your own war, you don't want your youth to read about how war is futile and about how there's no glory in dying for your country and that war will take something from you that you can never ever get back. Even though this is a fairly short book, it's like 300 pages, it took me 2 weeks to get through it because I had to keep taking breaks. So a really, really good book, but a very difficult read. I really needed a palate cleanser after that, so I read the last in the Percy Jackson series, The Last Olympian. This is the big finale, and it is basically just one massive battle set in New York City over several days. I've never been a big fan of battle scenes. Those are usually the passages that I kind of zone out through when it comes up. So an entire book of that wasn't really my thing, but Rick Riordan's writing is still really good, which made it a fun read. It's a really satisfying ending to the series, and I really liked the conclusion and where all of the characters ended up. That's it. That was the last book that I read in the month of May. But what about you? What did you read in May? What was your favorite book? Please let me know in the comments because I would love to see. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have a wonderful day and I hope that I will see you in the next video. Bye!